My grandmother caused the Hindenburg airship crash to save humanity from the evil that had been unleashed on board. My grandmother Rose was one of those people who never took any kind of nonsense from anyone. She would call anyone on their lies and tell people her opinion of them to their faces. It was one of the reasons I loved and respected her so much, as she was one of my role models. She was one of the survivors of the Hindenburg airship crash, but would rarely speak of it. I had to do an essay for my college based on an experience that one of my family had, and I decided to use her experience aboard the Hindenburg. I tried asking her numerous times, but she would always come up with random excuses and walk off. I eventually cornered her and begged her to tell me. She sat there for a few moments with conflicting emotions crossing her face. She told me to sit down and she would tell me her story. I was so happy, as I hoped this would definitely get me into my dream college. She took a few deep breaths to steady herself and then began telling her tale. I vividly remember the day my father told me we would be traveling aboard the Hindenburg. It was a beautiful sunny day outside and he had come home early for work. He showed no joy telling me, and I could see a hint of fear on his face. I knew he worked as a scientist and he specialized in the occult. The German government at the time were obsessed with, as they believed they could harness it to their advantages. I stood in awe as I gazed at the airship for the first time. It was like something out of a dream, as it looked so futuristic. My father was standing off to one side organizing a lot of boxes and crates to be brought on board. There was a couple of armed men helping him while looking around to make sure that no one was paying them too much attention. My father ushered my mother and I inside, and we made our way to our cabin. All of the cabin crew were so friendly, and I was the happiest I had ever been. I remember looking out the windows as the airship rose into the sky and being amazed at how everything seemed so small on the ground so far below. I carried a lighter that my grandmother had gifted me, and my mother kept warning me to be careful with it. I spent the day wandering the airship until it got dark, and I knew I better go back before my parents got annoyed. I was awoken by hushed whispers and looked up to see my father talking to one of the crew. Both of them looked terrified as they practically ran out of the cabin. I was curious as to what was going on, so I decided to follow them. I almost lost track of them as I crept behind them, as they were in such a hurry. They eventually ended up in a room full of crates. They were standing over a crate that had fallen over and was now completely smashed. They were arguing loudly, and my father kept saying she is free now and will kill us all. I got nervous and started backing away when I bumped into something. My father heard the noise and came rushing over to me. He told me to go back to our cabin and he would follow me shortly. I remember sitting in our cabin and being worried that I might be in trouble. My father eventually came in and he looked troubled. He took a minute or two to even remember that I was standing there. He looked at me and told me to be careful in the next few days and not to trust people, not even him or my mother. I probably had a confused expression on my face as he began to explain that he was tasked with bringing an artifact to America. There was a demon inside that his team had trapped using some occult rituals. The plan had been to unleash it on American soil to cause as much chaos as possible, but now he fears it was possibly free aboard this airship. He told me to go back to bed, and I lay there for the rest of the night thinking about what he told me. I got up the next morning to find both of my parents missing from the cabin. I just assumed that they had gone for breakfast, so quickly got dressed and went looking for them. I kept getting a weird feeling that someone was watching me, but every time I looked around then there would be nobody there. I walked around the airship for a few minutes but couldn't find anyone. I could hear chanting in the distance but couldn't seem to locate where it was coming from. I finally found one of the crew who was standing facing a wall. I tapped him on the back with the intention of asking where my parents were. I took a few steps back out of fright when he turned around and I saw his face. His eyes were completely black and a glowing orange substance seemed to be seeping out of the orifices on his face. His mouth opened up and he sprayed the liquid towards me. It just missed me by inches, but he was spraying it out like a hosepipe and the liquid on the ground seemed to be moving towards me. I took off running and I could hear his footsteps slowly following after me. I turned a corner and was ecstatic as I recognized my parents in the distance. I ran up to them and hugged them from the back as I knew they would protect me. My heart sank when I gazed up into their faces to see the same orange liquid covering their faces. I once again ran off in the hopes of finding someone else normal. I spent the rest of the day sneaking around the airship but found no one else who hadn't been changed. I was constantly having to change direction after rounding a corner to find one of the other passengers blocking my path. They were slow moving, so it was easy enough to escape them. I found a secluded corner and decided to get some sleep. I had a bad night's sleep as I kept waking up thinking that they had found me. I pushed myself out of my hiding place and was starving as I hadn't eaten since the day before. I remembered where the dining hall was and began cautiously making my way there. The chanting I had heard the previous day seemed to be getting louder the closer I got to the dining hall. I know I should have fled, but the curiosity got the best of me. I pushed open the door and slowly made my way inside. I stopped dead in my tracks as I gazed at what was unfolding inside. All of the other passengers and crew were bowing and chanting towards a misty figure that seemed to resemble a woman. I would have called her beautiful, except for the fact that her face was locked in an expression of pure hatred. I could hear her issuing orders to her new followers and telling them that when we land, they will carve out an empire in her name. I recognized my parents at the back as they were still wearing the clothes from yesterday, and they were now soaked in that weird liquid. The demon finally spotted me, and I could see a smile cross her face. She used her finger to indicate for me to come over to her. My feet started to move of their own accord, and I had no power over them. I let out a yelp of pain as my hip hit off a table. Whatever hold she had over me was broken at this moment and I began moving away. She let out an ear-splitting scream, and all her followers began moving towards me. I quickly grabbed some food and fled before they could catch me. I spent the rest of the day moving around as I was constantly being chased. They were slow moving, so I could easily outrun them, but I was afraid of being cornered and turned into whatever she had turned my parents into. I once again slept in a remote area and was lucky enough not to be discovered. I awoke and knew that I had to do something to stop this airship from landing. Today was the 6th, and we were meant to reach America today. It would only take one of her followers escaping this airship to cause chaos. I began considering a few possible ideas, but dismissed them as being too stupid. I knew that the airship was full of hydrogen gas which was flammable, so it meant the best way to destroy us was a fire. I hid for the next few hours as I heard crashes from around the airship as her followers tried desperately to locate my hiding spot. I waited until the entire airship seemed silent before moving out to enact my plan. I started grabbing paper and anything else I could find that would burn. I gazed out one of the windows and spotted land in the distance and knew that I needed to move quickly or else. I moved towards the sound of chanting and once again discovered the demon being worshipped by the people that she had converted on board. I locked eyes with her for a moment before placing my grandmother's lighter onto the papers I had gathered. I had a moment's panic when the lighter didn't produce a flame. The panic was short-lived as a flame quickly appeared and engulfed the flammable material I had brought. I flung the burning materials at her and watched it harmlessly bounce off her. Her smile got wider and she looked like she was laughing at my stupidity. I gazed out the window to discover we were now above land and were approaching some kind of tower. Her followers started to turn towards me, and one of them accidentally kicked the burning materials against a table. It set the tablecloth on fire, and the fire began to spread across the room. The demon let out a cry, and her follow tried in vain to put out the fire, but it was spreading too rapidly. The demon began to wither and withdraw into itself as the fire took over. The next few minutes was chaotic as the entire airship suddenly became aflame. Whatever hold the demon had over everyone was broken, and the passengers and crew were rushing around trying to escape. I saw my mother and grabbed her arm and dragged her over to one of the windows. I used a nearby vase to smash it open and then forced my mother to jump out. There was no sign of my father, so I jumped out the window to the ground below. I remember looking up at the airship to see the demon standing there were flames covering her body. She only stood there for a moment before her body imploded. All of the surviving crew and passengers were confused as to what had happened as they couldn't remember what had transpired over the last few days. I kept my mouth shut as I knew no one would ever believe me. My father didn't escape the airship and I felt guilty knowing that I had caused his death, even though I had probably saved millions of lives. My mother and I decided to stay in America and never looked back. I sat there with my mouth hanging agape as my grandmother finished her tale. I assumed that she was lying until she showed me an old black and white photo of some beautiful-looking woman aboard the airship as it was burning. My grandmother smiled at me and told me she was tired and wanted to go to sleep. She passed away in her sleep that night, so I never got to ask her any more questions. I have taken an interest in the occult since then, but I must warn people not to mess around with it, as you may awaken something that could kill us all.